People like Obama, people like Biden had done precious little for Ukraine. It was amazing for me to watch how they always gave them just enough to not die tomorrow or next week, but never enough to be able to take down the Kerch Bridge. So that's the similarity between Mussolini and Trump, that they are very good with crowds. They can manipulate them. They can make them laugh. They can make them boo. They can make them approve. They can make them disapprove, and so on.
Yeah. I think somebody who worked with him called him a toddler or a 5-year-old.
Oh, well, yeah, General McMaster, a 4-star general, who, of course, accepted an invitation to work for him during the first term. So this is not some sort of a left-wing, transgender, feminist activist. This is a United States Army 4-star general.
Today's episode features Dr. Lukasz. He's also a professor of history and international relations in Boston University. He specializes in Central European history, East European politics, and contemporary Russia. He's also a published author of several books on post-war and post-USSR history in Central Europe. I hope you enjoy it, and given that this is a new podcast, please let me know what you think in the comments. Who would you like to see as our new guest next episode? And also, is there anything we could improve about your experience? Enjoy. Right now, United States is very much insistent that Ukraine has to be able to let go of some of its territories. To me, it seems similar to the Munich Agreement back in 1938. I was wondering if you would share a little bit more of history of those days and if you see any similarities.
Well, indeed, I do see many similarities, and one must always start with a caveat that, of course, no two historical events are identical. The 1930s was a unique time in history, just as today we are at a unique stage in history, and times have changed, technology has changed, the main actors have changed, the script is different, the director is different, and so on. All of this is true, and we must constantly remind ourselves that similarities doesn't mean that we're talking about identities. But I do see many important and I think revealing similarities and indeed even lessons that can be drawn from Munich. And I think finally I should also add another point by way of introduction, and that is that my own views regarding Munich have evolved significantly. I wrote a book about it in the 1990s, and I think when I now look back at it, I think it's accurate, but I think I probably would have chosen to formulate certain conclusions differently. In any case, I think I see I think I saw similarities between the Czech crisis and the Ukrainian situation. I think it jumped at me for the first time in 2014 with Putin's occupation of Crimea and Donbass, because not so much really because of the clumsy defection, clumsy deception that the occupation forces were allegedly kind people. I think that's the expression that Putin used at that time. And then he, I think, conceded that they were perhaps Russians, but they were truck drivers who took a vacation and did the occupation on their own free time, so to say, simply out of patriotic fervor. But anyway, all of this set aside, I think the main argument was that the population in those parts, in Crimea, was close to 80% Russian. I'm sure most of them were probably employed by the Russian Navy, and they were Russian naval officers, NCOs, and their families. Mm-hmm. And then Donbass, which, of course, historically was closer to Russia, linguistically, religiously, and so on. So it so much reminded me of the situation in, I think, March 1938, when Hitler carried out the Anschluss of Austria. So this is even before the Czech crisis, right? So he marches into Austria. And when the French and the British sort of sit up and start finally paying attention, and of course the Czechs are in a panic mode because he's now not only facing Czechoslovakia from the west, but he's now also at the southern border, which was poorly defended, given that Austria was a neutral country, and so the Czech military didn't expect to be attacked from there. The lessons of Belgium in the previous war notwithstanding, obviously. So when the world started paying attention, the Germans said, "Oh, don't you worry your little heads in London, in Paris, in Prague. This has nothing to do with you. We are simply uniting German speakers with German speakers. The very existence of Austria as a sovereign country it really makes no sense. And after all, the Führer was born in Austria.
Yeah.
So therefore, now that he's the Chancellor of Germany, he can bring these two entities together." And the French and the British were delighted with this lie. They knew it was a lie, but they accepted it because it allowed them to do nothing. And the Czechs were, of course, as I said, in a panicky mood. The military knew that this was a catastrophe, but their politicians were summoned by, in fact, Göring played an important role in this. He summoned the Czech minister in Berlin, his name was Masny, and said, "This has nothing to do with you. I am not interested, or Germany, or the Führer is not interested in other ethnicities. He only wants German speakers. This is all about Deutschtum, about the Germanness of these people, right? I mean, never mind that, Vienna, of course, was an international city that ethnically reflected the composition of the old Habsburg Empire. That's beside the point. Simply, it happened, and the linguistic lie, namely, they speak German, we speak German, therefore this is not an occupation.
That's funny that both situations happen because of the language. Like Russia's also like, they're repressing the Russian speakers.
Exactly. It worked. And I could see how this lie was accepted in Washington, how it was accepted in London, in Paris, and in Germany. They were all relieved. Like, this is not really World War III. We don't need to panic. Of course, if it had been World War III, they wouldn't have known what to do about it.
Yeah.
They were not ready. Very much like the French and the British, the Czechs and so on. They were not prepared to take action against Hitler. So they were relieved to be finally, to be served a reason to do nothing. And so they did nothing. So I think, this is where I clearly see some significant parallel. That's the linguistic lie that if I speak German, you speak German, therefore I can start up tanks or I can unleash bombers and bomb you into submission until you accept that we are actually one nation and should be therefore one country.
Yeah. I think historically, the Munich Agreement was considered a mistake. I think some opinions vary, but overall.
But what do you mean by was considered historically a mistake? I think it was actually historically considered a triumph of diplomacy. It was celebrated, as you know, I'm sure, in crowds gathered in Paris to welcome the Prime Minister Daladier, who returned from Munich. Crowds welcomed Prime Minister Chamberlain as he returned to London. He was received by the royal family, greeted crowds from the Buckingham Palace. And all of this is not to laugh at those crowds. I totally get it. They were relieved that there will not be, hopefully, another conflagration, which made absolute sense to every normal thinking human being. The trouble was that Hitler deceived them, Hitler lied to them. He wanted war. He didn't want only the German speakers, this time not from Austria, but from the Sudetenland, the minority. Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, another parallel with Donbass and so on.
The argument that I've heard is that we tried the appeasement with the aggressor and it failed. Like, I guess looking back, I've heard an opinion that we should have woken up faster. This was sort of like a call to be alarmed. And I think right now a lot of European countries are waking up and building out their military, even starting from 2014, but very much so now. Do you think Ukraine giving up some of its territory under the pressure of Washington is going to also be a sort of an appeasement step and ultimately a mistake that's going to lead to the next conflict?
Well, let's step back and suggest another parallel with the 1930s. That in 1935, if I'm not mistaken, Hitler renewed military obligatory service for the Germans, which was in violation of the Versailles peace treaty, of course. And the next year he marched into the Rhineland completely unopposed, although at that time Germany didn't really have a viable armed force. And we learned subsequently, although of course nobody knew it at that time, that if especially the French had taken aggressive action against this clear violation of Versailles, then the German troops that marched into the Rhineland were under orders immediately to retreat. Mm-hmm. Right? But so this is the parallel, I think, that you're probably driving at with Western Europe, that probably was unhappy with Putin's behavior at least by 2014. Mm-hmm. But they were unable to do anything about it, because their public opinion certainly would not have supported some large-scale rearmament mm-hmm. on behalf of an event that really made no sense to anyone. So what's the big deal that Donbass, people don't even know where Donbass is on the map in Britain and in France. Crimea, it's a complicated business. Yeah. Yes, the French and the British fought a war and defeated Russia in the 19th century in Crimea. But that's all forgotten and so on. And it didn't go all that well, the charge of the Light Brigade and so on. But I think that at that point in 2014, there simply wasn't any public support for a more aggressive stand. And this, I think, is the biggest weakness of the anti-appeasement criticism that is now being post factum launched at the French and the British. Yes, it's all very well that we now know that Hitler was unappeasable, and yes, he was unappeasable. Mm-hmm. But no, it's not entirely clear what the French and the British could have done in 1935, 1936, 1937, 1938, because the public opinion in Britain and France was totally against war.
Yeah.
And there was no money for the military. The French military was a shell. It was essentially a make-believe facade. It was a Potemkin village of sorts. The British military, this is notoriously well known, was unprepared to defend as late as in 1940 the British Isles, never mind defending Czechoslovakia against Hitler in 1938. And people forget that even such critics of appeasement as Prime Minister Churchill had never said in 1935, 1936, 1938, and during Munich, he never said, let's go to war. Mm-hmm. He never said that because he knew that Britain was unprepared. Just as the West Europeans were unable to see the Russian threat. Mm-hmm. And just as they had essentially been disarming for decades, dismantling their military industry and so on. Right? It's all to appease the electorate. You know?
So in a way, for democratic countries to sort of step up their military, there has to be this large enough event to really disturb the populace so that that potential higher involvement is possible.
Well, you're not mistaken. People forget that ultimately it was Hitler who declared war on the United States. It's not that the United States declared war on Hitler. And Hitler declared war on the United States in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And it was Pearl Harbor that then allowed President Roosevelt, who had been much, much more cautious in dealing with British cries for help than is generally believed. People think that Roosevelt was more or less plotting behind the backs of Congress to one way or the other to support the British, if not even to drag America in violation of the neutrality laws passed by Congress into war. No, he was actually very cautious indeed. Mm-hmm. But it really took Pearl Harbor for him to say, day of infamy, we're going to war.
Yeah. And Japanese didn't even expect that that would be enough to drag the United States into the war. Well, I wanted to fast forward in history a little bit. I think Central Eastern Europe is such an interesting region that is going through a transition from sort of Russian Eastern land into like sort of the Western world. And I know you had some criticism in terms of the transition of Czech Republic, some of the other countries right post the fall of the USSR. What do you think could have been done better? And how do you see this transition continuing? As I think like Ukraine is, for example, another country that we still sort of don't know. Is it like so much still, there is so much Eastern influence and Russia doesn't want to let go of it, but it's trying to transition. I guess what have been some like successes of countries that have transitioned? What have been some failures?
Well, it's a very wide question, of course. I think I would, again, as a historian, I fall back on the experience we had with the post-war Germany and post-war Japan. They were both successes, great successes, and I would submit that what is often forgotten is to what extent they are successes because of the Allied hands-on involvement both in Germany and in Japan. In Japan, in fact, General MacArthur famously is credited to have written the Japanese post-war constitution. Yeah. So this is this I would call an involvement. And as far as Germany was concerned, the denazification isn't something that sort of emanated from within of German society. In fact, Germany's reaction to the crimes of Nazism in 45, 46 probably were, well, you know, we were all victims of one man or maybe 6, 7, maybe 18 men all together, and they were the Nazis, they were responsible. And what were we expected to do? If we didn't obey, the Gestapo would pick us up, or the Wehrmacht would shoot us for desertion. So we served the way everybody else was expected to serve. So I think that there was a general kind of reluctance to dramatize the responsibility of each citizen for the Hitler regime, for the Holocaust, for the crimes committed in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Poland, especially in those three countries. But it was the Allies who came in with their hobnailed boots and said, no, before you can be a gymnasium teacher, a high school teacher in post-war Germany, we want to know why you joined the Nazi Party. And those people had to appear before denazification boards. I don't know the details, whether this would involve even kindergarten teachers, for instance, but I wouldn't be surprised that simply teachers who were given the responsibility for educating generations of new Germans, that they all had to appear before some denazification boards. It was true about judges, for instance, that if you were a notorious judge Nazi who simply was a transmission belt for orders coming from the Nazi Party, and you imposed the death penalty and so on orders of politicians rather than acting within the legal system, you were dismissed. Now, the picture is more complicated because by the late 1950s, some of these denazified Nazis start reappearing again. That's a different issue. But what I'm trying to say is that the victorious Allies assumed responsibility for the ideological, ethical, moral responsibility for post-war Germany. They saw to it that those countries would not be governed in the post-war by the same criminals who had driven Germany, and with it the whole planet really, into the catastrophe of the Holocaust and so on, right? Now, switch to the early 1990s when communism is melting away before our eyes. The Soviet Union is just a few signatures and it's gone. By the way, on the initiative of Russia rather than the other republics. That's a different issue. And the world is watching, just sort of from the sidelines with their mouths wide open. People in London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington, they're absolutely passive. They pretend that it's never happening, that it has nothing to do with them. And yet, they just defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And how did the West react to that great defeat? The best quotation is from President H.W. Bush, who said, "I'm not going to dance on the wall. It would be imprudent. It would be improper. It would be, in victory, one must be magnanimous." Well, it's great to be magnanimous in history if you are Bismarck and you have just defeated Franz Josef at the Battle of Königgrätz in 1866, if I'm not mistaken. Please be magnanimous. But the West just defeated communism that created untold, that caused crimes, caused suffering, killed many, many people. And the West never celebrated its victory. The West never even acknowledged its victory. And therefore, the West never assumed any responsibility for the moral and ethical face of the post-communist, post-Soviet republics and Eastern Europe. which meant that suddenly the old governing elite was booted out, the way the Americans actually would repeat the mistake in Iraq in 2003, where they would kick out with Saddam Hussein, the old ruling elite. And well, who comes to fill the vacuum? In Eastern Europe, these were mostly the sort of sharks who had sharp elbows and could muscle out everybody else to gain a position to so-called privatize the state-owned industry. Now, in most countries, it actually still worked well, in part because there had been dissidents who could transition Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary from the communist era to the post-communist era. So they were able to fill the vacuum for a year or two until the next elections pushed them aside also and replaced them with these technicians, engineers of power, these sharks that are mentioned. But at least there was this, people like Wałęsa, people like Václav Havel, and others were able to fill the vacuum after the fall of communism, and therefore they were able to prevent the events that happened in Russia and all the other post-communist countries where there had been no dissidents because they had been killed or destroyed in Siberia and so on.
By the sharks, do you mean the oligarchs
or
their
their
Muppets?
the future oligarchs, indeed, which is, of course, what happened in Russia, where people who had, been cab drivers in a matter of a few months became one of the richest people on this planet. One was a Komsomol organizer, one was a failed playwright who was a cab driver, and all these people suddenly privatized huge chunks of industries of the Soviet Union that involved really, value of billions of dollars. And of course, there was no ethics, there were no rules. It was all about turning off the lights, going at it with sharp elbows, if not knives. And once the lights were turned on again, who held the property was the lawful owner.
Yeah. Do you think there was a country that's exemplary in how they handled this transition?
Well, I've mentioned Poland and Czechoslovakia, and I would submit that those countries did reasonably well. Hungary initially seemed like the fair-haired boy of Eastern Europe because it had sort of sub rosa in secrecy been privatizing under the Soviet radar on their own while Gorbachev was still in power. So when 1989 came a calling, they were more open to Western investors. And so GE and other large Western corporations decided that Budapest would be the platform from which they would emanate their activities, organize their activities in Eastern Europe. But that proved to be, I think, a premature decision because the Hungarians thought they didn't need to privatize. And so they actually didn't privatize, and the result is Orban and the present catastrophe in Hungary, whereas the Poles, the Czechs, knew very well indeed that they needed to focus on economic reform, not on flag waving and this kind of false patriotic fervor that you could see in Slovakia, for instance. And therefore, I think they ended up doing much better than in other countries. But, as I said, it was the total absence of the West in first of all affirming the immorality and the cruelty and illegality of many of the consequences of the communist governments there, that created this kind of moral uncertainty, which is why you can now look at various countries in Eastern Europe and discover that the former communists remain active in politics, which could not have happened if somebody had said that communism caused nearly as criminal outrages against human rights as did the Nazis.
Seems like most of the countries to the western border of Russia have transitioned into Western societies. I think that's something that makes Putin very angry. I think they're unhappy how much West has claimed of its past territories. And going back to our conversation about could any appeasement be successful, are you worried once the situation in Ukraine is resolved, however it's going to end, that Putin will advance further? Some people talk about Poland, some people talk about Latvia, Estonia. Other countries you're the most worried about, and where do you think his ambition ends?
Well, so first of all, when you use the expression resolved in reference to the situation in Ukraine, you apparently mean that Ukraine would be defeated.
I imagine
and now your
some
question
view.
is, what would Putin do then if he stands on the borders with Poland, for instance, right?
With Ukraine, I guess my expectation is that there's going to be a deal first, but Ukraine will remain still independent. I guess that will.
You
not-
mean semi-independent Russian protectorate of sorts?
The Western Ukraine will be independent, but the Eastern Ukraine, some parts of it would, I imagine, be under control.
Look, you know, I don't know the future, and I am a long-term optimist, although the present situation seems nothing short of catastrophic. Nevertheless, I am a great believer that that nobody can suppress the Ukrainian nation that has forged itself on the battlefields at the price of hundreds of thousands of its citizens being destroyed by Putin, by his criminal war of aggression. But I, of course, don't know the future, and I don't know what Putin might want to do. However, I do know that dictators like him are always facing the difficulty of knowing where to stop. So now that you've conquered or succeeded, whichever way you want to call it, in Ukraine, the citizenry expects your next success. Because if you're a dictator, if you don't dare to grant people the free right to choose their politicians, then you have to feed the public successes. And now that you've allegedly succeeded in Ukraine, what's next? Well, you do have to continue. Even if you perhaps think it's irrational, you're driven to continue. Look at Napoleon, look at Hitler. If Hitler had stopped in 1938, or indeed if he had stopped in March 1939, after he conquered the whole of Czechoslovakia and created the Slovak puppet state, the world would have totally accepted it and would have celebrated him as a great German leader. A few Czechs would have been killed by the Gestapo, protesting here and there, but, you know, that's not our issue.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, Ethiopia, Somalia in Africa. It's just not our issue. But he couldn't stop. It's not possible. Why did Napoleon have to invade Russia? He achieved everything a human being could have achieved. and he is driven to invade Russia, the one country where marching those distances alone will kill you. You don't even have to be shot at. And he did it. So I am convinced that somebody like Putin would immediately have the need to meddle with Estonia, meddle with Latvia, which has a significant Russian minority. And he would repeat the same scenario. The Latvians don't want to be part of NATO. They want to be part of Russian motherland and so on. And of course, Poland. But I think Poland is a uniquely difficult target for him, because the Poles are just waiting to roll up their sleeves and go at it. There is a tendency in Polish history to fight against all odds. And I think under the government of, under the present government, Tusk and people like Sikorski and so on, there will be no appeasement, I assure you. These people know their history, and they would fight to the end, and they won't wait to be punched.
What do you think is best course of action, I guess, for the West to prevent that? I think what Zelensky said in one of his speeches is that we're fighting for the entire Europe, meaning now that this conflict is active, Russia does not have the resources to begin the new one. But once the war in Ukraine ends, which I believe will end with some sort of agreement where there's still like fully independent from Russia, Ukrainian nation, but it will free up some resources for Russia to start something new because they have that continuous hunger. Is that a worry?
See, I'm not entirely sure that when Zelensky said that they fight not only for Ukraine, they're really fighting for Europe, I don't think he meant that because we tie down the military resources of Putin's here, therefore he cannot be invading Holland or Denmark. I don't think that's what he meant. I think what he meant was that in resisting the aggression, the Ukrainians dying by the hundreds of thousands are defending what the Germans called the Rechtsstaat, a state built on the rule of law. They are defending the principle that you cannot redesign borders just because you think your tanks are better than the other party's tanks. It's because you're a bigger bully, therefore we don't need to. I think basically he was defending international law. That's what I'm saying. And I think he has really done that. And you seem to think that after the war, there would be at least a part of Ukraine that would be, as you say, free. I think a Ukraine that is free, but with the provision that it won't be allowed to enter into NATO, that's not freedom, in my opinion. I think Ukraine needs to have the freedom to fully exercise Article 10 under the NATO treaty, which says that anybody can join as long as they uphold the values of the members of the organization. And if Ukraine, in fact, as a petitioner, can demonstrate that it has upheld all those values that I'm talking about, then I think it really deserves its membership in NATO more than countries that have done so little for the organization over the years. Think Spain, Portugal, Italy. What's the last time you heard about some military contribution from those countries to the general architecture of peace on this planet? The Ukrainians have paid with their lives for the right to make such decisions. And if the Russians, now with the assistance of the present landlord in the White House, want to dictate whether Ukraine can or cannot join NATO, or whether Brussels might somehow concede that Ukraine won't join the European Union, I think that's not victory for Ukraine as I would define it.
Is there any way around it for Ukraine? Is there anything that could be done for?
Well, yes, the West has to finally stop behaving the way it's been behaving. Never mind Trump, but even before him, people like Obama, people like Biden had done precious little for Ukraine. It was amazing for me to watch how they always gave them just enough to not die tomorrow or next week, but never enough to be able to take down the Kerch Bridge and to defend themselves against the glide bombs and that sort of thing that's been devastating hospitals and pregnant women, for heaven's sake, dying before the eyes of the world with Russian shrapnel in their bellies, and the West saying, well, here are a few more blankets and here are some pieces of artillery, but please don't fire too far. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not the way you fight a war. If you go to war, you have to go to win. Mm-hmm. And this is what people like Obama and criminally, frankly, people like Biden never really did understand. Mm-hmm. So I would assume that when there is a better leadership in the West, then the Ukrainians would receive the tools that they can so skillfully use, and they have demonstrated it repeatedly, and they will crush and defeat the Russian enemy. Yeah. And that, to me, is the only way to success.
So do you think the West is way too afraid of some nuclear threats that were coming from
Russia?
The
nuclear threat is absolutely hollow. You can ask any expert mm-hmm. on the use of nuclear weapons, and they will tell you. Much of this information is classified, but those that can speak about it will tell you that even if Putin, in some insane moment of his life, decided to throw away the future of Russia and use nuclear weapons in some tactical manner in Ukraine, mm-hmm. He wouldn't have been able to do so because the Russian system, to a great extent, replicates the American protocol mm-hmm. for use of nuclear weapons that guards against some insane person in the Oval Office mm-hmm. and puts so many layers between him and the actual launch that it just could not happen. Never mind the fact that even if Putin had somehow persuaded all the actors that would have been needed for him to open the chemodanchik, as the Russians call it, yeah. the football, as the Americans call it, mm-hmm. the suitcase with that links the leadership with the use of nuclear weapons. Even if he were able to do so, and perhaps even launch a tactical warhead on a target in Ukraine, which, by the way, he claims to be Russia. Mm-hmm. So he would be nuclear bombing his own country, and he claims the Ukrainians don't exist, so he would be killing his own people. And then his army would have to drive into the nuked area and perhaps die from radiation. Yeah. It makes absolutely no sense to me. And of course, once he would use a device like this, he would become the world's pariah, and the few allies that he has, starting with China, mm-hmm. and perhaps even Iran, and certainly countries that are kind of neutral in this East-West conflict, countries like India, Pakistan, mm-hmm. Both nuclear countries, of course, they would instantly turn against Russia mm-hmm. because they understand that nuclear weapons are very important for your own security as long as you don't use them.
Yeah. That's so interesting because I thought that Putin can do absolutely whatever he wants
No,
within Russia.
no,
How many people have to agree?
I don't know.
Okay, okay. Um, that's actually reassuring to know because I was definitely worried that I guess there is
No,
this
I think
belief.
it's. I don't think that knowledgeable people worry about that. I think that this is exactly the sort of a feeling among Western politicians that Putin wants to spread. This is exactly what kept Biden from doing what he could have done to finish the war much, much sooner with Ukrainian victory. It was constantly this empty threat that he ultimately bowed down to, but for no reason at all. And to say nothing that I think no one has really tested that the Russian nukes would even work. And given the pathetic standard of the Russian military that's been revealed by the Ukrainians, which is another service they had done to the world. It's not just the sort of legal, upholding certain moral, ethical, legal principles. It's also that with their fight, they have shown the hollowness of the Russian army.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are so many jokes about second army in the world and their tanks are falling apart as they're driving. I wanted to switch our conversation across the Atlantic and read a quote by you. I think there's certainly similarities between Trump and Mussolini. On the other hand, Mussolini was an intellectual. Could you tell us more and why, in your opinion, Trump is most the best parallels could be drawn to Mussolini?
Well, Mussolini liked to bully people. He liked to shout at crowds. He loved to massage crowds. He had a charisma. And I think Putin may tried to become that and utterly failed. I think it is Trump that has succeeded. He loves crowds.
Yeah.
He is very good with crowds. He can play them. He can play them the way, rock and roll artists. I'm too old to have been to a rock and roll concert in the past 40 years. But I think the one or two concerts that I've seen was that I could see the sort of communication between the band on the stage and how the crowd responded to subtle signals, many of which escaped me because even then I was too old to get those signals. So Trump is brilliant. I think he is, in that sense, one of the most talented politicians of his generation. He oozes charisma. Right? Many people can read whatever positive things they project into politicians. They can find it in him. But the point about so that's the similarity between Mussolini and Trump, that they are very good with crowds. They can manipulate them. They can make them laugh. They can make them boo. They can make them approve. They can make them disapprove, and so on. But I think that ultimately there is a big difference, and that is that Trump's attention span involves something like a postcard. I have never really I've never worked in the White House with Mr. Trump, but many people have, and they have written books and testified that his attention span is extremely short.
Yeah,
and if you look at his spelling and so on, his syntax, you can tell that this is not somebody who is capable of paying attention. I don't believe he's read books in the past many years. And people forget that, by contrast, Mussolini was a serious writer. He wrote about heretics in the church. At Harvard, you can find a book translated even into English from young Mussolini about Jan Hus, a religious reform, 15th century reformer, it required some study of sources, and he did it. So I consider Mussolini obviously an evil creature, a fascist, reprehensible, horrible, horrible person, but an intellectual. Um, um, whereas Trump, I think, is just a sort of an orange, empty person who can manipulate and bully others.
Yeah. I think somebody who worked with him called him a toddler or a 5-year-old.
Oh, well, yeah, General McMaster, a four-star general, who, of course, accepted an invitation to work for him during the first term. So this is not some sort of a left-wing, transgender, feminist activist. This is a United States Army four-star general. And there are many, many others. His former Secretary of State who used the F word and also talked about toddlers and kindergartners.
Yeah.
Kindergartners specifically, the former Secretary of State. So yes, everybody who has been in contact with him testified to the president's inability to focus on anything for more than 15 seconds.
I think this second term feels different. A lot of people on the left are especially scared. You studied a lot of totalitarian rulers. Should United States be worried about Trump, or is it a bit exaggerated?
Well, I don't know what you mean by the United States. I think I would say Americans should be worried.
Yes.
You know? I think I am a very proud American citizen. It was other than events in my own family. Becoming a U.S. citizen was something emotionally very important for me. At the height of the Cold War, I sort of nailed my values to the mast of the ship called America. And it literally brings tears to my eyes to see events like January 6th, or indeed the current 6-7 weeks that we have watched in the White House unfolding. It makes me deeply depressed. And when you think about what's happening with American science, American universities, this is on top of the Ukrainian catastrophe in the Oval Office last Friday, with these repulsive people like J.D. Vance trying to lecture a man who's proven himself with his own life, proven himself as a man of great courage, and he is being treated like some sort of a irrelevant individual by this creature who doesn't reach up to Zelensky's ankles. I was appalled, and I actually applauded Professor Snyder, who submitted an essay in which he described this episode in the Oval Office as an anti-Semitic outrage, because they literally ganged up on a person they considered a little Jew, and they could show them what they, the sort of white ruling class, can do to some Jewish petitioner. Oh, don't tell us about your propaganda tours. I have never been to Ukraine, but I know everything about it.
Do you know that J.D. Vance's brother actually joined Ukraine to fight in one of the foreign legions? And he shared that J.D. Vance has never reached out to him to ask a single question about how it's over there.
Well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Obviously one is not responsible in good things and bad things for one's family. So I would focus only on J.D. Vance and his behavior that brought tears to my eyes of shame for America.
Do you think Russia aside, other countries know how to handle Trump? And has anybody sort of figured out the deal making?
Well, they are learning. Initially the reaction was one of amusement. I will take over Panama. So okay, the Chinese run the Panama Canal. Turns out the Chinese do not run the Panama Canal. It's a Panamanian authority that runs the canal. The Chinese have 2 ports in the area. America has 2 ports in the area. There is nothing wrong with having a port facility for your own shipping in the area. What people pay less attention to, by the way, this is a footnote when it comes to Panama, is that Mr. Trump built a hotel in Panama. That and that, of course, is territory which is notorious for drugs and money laundering. And people call that hotel Narco Al Largo or something like this.
Oh my God, I didn't know.
Yes, and there are many Russian oligarchs who apparently own units in that hotel. Mm-hmm. So when all of this started, when he proposed to declare war on Denmark, which, by the way, people don't know that he had called the prime minister, a woman of Denmark, 5 days before he became president, and already threatened her with action because she wasn't too thrilled when he said he was going to buy Greenland from her. Okay? Yeah. This is 5 days before he even took the oath. So people thought this was funny, right? So TV comedians made a big deal. He was going to invade Canada. He was going to buy Greenland. Or if the Greenlanders were not happy enough, he would invade them also. I think they now take it more seriously. And you can see with tariffs, the Canadians have imposed on electricity or threatened to impose on electricity for the northern, for the US states along the Canadian border, that they know how to fight back. Mm-hmm. And certainly the new Canadian government will not roll over and play dead. The Premier of Ontario, Mr. Ford, is a pugnacious guy. All these people are hockey players. If somebody drops gloves, they go and fight.
Yeah. I had another question about Trump. From your presentation about 4 years ago, when General Clapper compared Trump to a Russian asset, you thought of it as a bit too far of a comparison, but there are a lot of traces of like money wiring from Russia to Trump. Do you think now it is a crazy thing to sort of seriously think whether or not he's a Russian asset?
I can't comment on money wiring from Russia to Trump. If you have such evidence, then you should really bring it up.
Through like VTB Bank or something like that?
Well, yes. Well, I studied that, but all you can really show is that Deutsche Bank established a condominium with the VTB Bank that is used by Russian intelligence services for money laundering and paying assets abroad and so on. That doesn't mean that they pay Trump. Mm-hmm. So that's an issue. But yes, I did hear General Clapper, whom I regard very highly, to say that that Trump behaves as a Russian asset. Mm-hmm. Now, is he a Russian asset? He didn't say that. He said he behaves as one. And that, of course, is hugely different. And I think he said that because in order to be an asset, be someone's agent, you have to have a control officer who gives you tasks, who gives you orders, who says, you go and break into this facility and photograph and steal these documents for me, or I want you to declare war on Holland. And these are your orders, do it or we will destroy you. Can they do it to Trump? I don't believe so. I think in part, well, I have actually two reasons for that. Number one, Trump has no discipline. And in order to be a real spy, you have to have lots of discipline or you die very quickly. You have to, have tradecraft. You have to hide your secret ink in a place that your children won't find or the cleaning lady won't stumble upon and run to the FBI with the next day. So Trump has no discipline, and therefore he cannot be an agent. And I think that finally, the theory is that there are some videotapes of Mr. Trump being involved in some immoral activities that would shock the American public, which I firmly believe that such a possibility is possible, that such tapes may exist. Mr. Trump, since the early 1990s, traveled to the communist bloc countries, specifically to Czechoslovakia. His first wife was Czech. And the Czech Secret Service opened a file on him. And as a matter of routine, they immediately alerted their Soviet big brothers to the existence, to the presence of this American mogul in a communist bloc country. So nobody has seen the Soviet or Russian now documents on Trump, but I have seen the Czech documents on him, and they are routine. Basically, the Czech secret police recruited Trump's wife's father as a secret informer.
Oh, wow.
Which is completely normal because he wanted to see his daughter in America, and the Secret Service wanted him to go to America to tell him more about Trump. So as a precondition of the passport, he had to sign up to be an informer. I don't think he told them anything. What could he have told them? Trump in the 70s, 80s was a kind of a playboy in New York. He was a quintessential New Yorker. There were drugs, there was prostitution. It was a totally different America at the time. And I don't think that he was in any way whatsoever involved in anything remotely political. That came much, much later. I think his first entree into politics was in 1987, by the way, when he took out a page-long advertisement in the New York Times, which was directed against Japan. He claimed the Japanese were exploiting America economically, and at the same time, the Americans were guaranteeing their national security, which is true. So that came only in 1987. So I think that Trump most likely is not an agent because he lacks the discipline of being one. And as far as the blackmail with the tapes is concerned, we have learned so many details from his private life. He has been even found guilty in 34 counts out of 34 counts of sexual assault, which is another word for rape in the state of New York. And the public elected him into the White House. All of this had happened before the elections. So fully aware of this fact, over 77 million voted for Trump. So would they have been somehow dissuaded if they saw Trump with some prostitutes in Moscow? I don't think so. But that doesn't mean that there are certain things that he doesn't want the Russians to reveal, especially of financial nature.
That makes sense. Yeah, it seems like there's nothing public could be surprised by in terms of Trump's misbehaviors.
They seem to be amused by it. They seem to applaud it. I think people in the 21st century now mistake politics and entertainment. You know, Plato famously thought that only the best minds, only the least conflicted and the most educated people among us should be the rulers. And I think the present state of Western democracy indicates in exactly the opposite direction. You have to be an entertainer. I mean, it's not just Trump. I look at people like Boris Johnson. You know, I mean, that's just an example. The British were notorious for these kind of, you know, stiff upper lip Britishers who hardly ever even smiled, and they never condescended to speaking down to the masses. Here is Boris Johnson, you know, hanging from cranes, waving British flags during the opening of the Olympic Games and so on. And he was a very popular politician, briefly, in Britain. So I don't think it's only America. I think there's a trend toward mistaking entertainment and politics. And I think Trump is exactly the right person to fill this kind of need of the TV generations of Americans who need to be entertained by this orange-skinned person.
Since we're speaking of conspiracy theories, I just have one last one I'd like to share and get your thoughts on. There's this very old video from 20 years ago on YouTube where a KGB agent speaks how they want to manufacture this like far left in the United States, wokeness as the way to divide America. Do you believe that like the wokeness, the far left, was manufactured in the US by KGB?
Yes, but I would actually suggest that they have devoted the same energy or similar comparable energy to created extremists on the right. I think their objective is not, or their objective was not to create transgender bathrooms and you know, or the allegedly 7 kinds of bathrooms that supposedly exist in EU or something like this. I think what they want to do is to dilute the West, to make the West less successful, to make it less united, to drive it into cultural wars. If you can no longer have a little war between Germany and France, as one could in the 19th century, and Russia could sit under the Tsars on the side and watch with some amusement, this is no longer possible thanks to the unification and all the positive processes that took place in the aftermath of World War II. Since that's no longer possible, then at least cultural wars. And I think with the arrival of the social media, this became possible because you can have some guy in cut-off jeans who sits somewhere in St. Petersburg and who works for GRU, and he creates some sort of a Ku Klux Klan unit in Indiana that actually ends up existing in Indiana, and it meets in some corner of some public space. So some other cut-off jeans gentleman for GRU from St. Petersburg creates a Black Lives Matter unit that organizes a counter-demonstration against the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana, and you have a divided state, and extremes from left and right serve Mr. Putin. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, they support wokeness, yes, whatever it is, yes, they support left-wing extremists, but they also are just as willing to support fascists and Ku Klux Klan and the January the 6th conspirators on the right, because it destroys the ability of the West, and it really deprives democratic citizens of their ability to believe in their own system, in their elections. And when people stop paying attention to their political environment, the worst among us seize power.
Yeah.
And that's all Putin needs to do. So I don't think it's left or right. It's just about disunity.
I have just a few more questions about Russia. When Biden first heard about Russian invasion plans of Ukraine, I think he was in disbelief because it simply doesn't make sense. It's going to hurt Russian economy. There's really no benefit to it. What is Putin's goals? Do they care about Russian wealth, or they're pursuing something completely different?
Well, I think that I would have to go back to 1935, 1936, the rearmament of Germany, and marching into the Rhineland, and all those things that happened in 1938. I think people like Biden were rational actors. And they had every reason to believe what you just quoted him to believe, that this was not in Russia's interest. Why would he need to do this when he could, in fact, and he's done it in the past many times, manipulate the elections in Ukraine in such a manner that the next president is essentially a lapdog of the Kremlin. And if he really fails to get a lapdog into a leadership position in Kyiv, then they poison him, or they shoot him, or they do something else. And yes, the West will suspect that the poisoning, the shooting was probably done by the Russians, but who is going to go to war because of this? It's never been proven. And how many airplanes have been shot out of the skies by the Russians, and the West never had the courage to take some decisive action to punish Russia for that? How many people have been murdered on the streets of Britain, Germany, London, France? How many Russian dissidents, Soviet dissidents have died, and the West had done nothing? So Putin, I think, had every reason to believe that it'll be just like after 2014, Crimea and Donbass. So I need a little success to show to my dumb voters who watch television, Jedinka and all these channels that serve them my propaganda. So I will drive tanks. Ukraine will collapse in 2.5 days. I'll be in Kyiv, and I will have a victory parade, and everything will be hunky-dory. And I will be, Caesar. I will grow into the dimensions of Peter the Great. So I think that it was, rational for Biden to think what he thought. But I would actually not blame Biden here at all. I think Biden had done everything he could have done to dissuade Putin from taking this disastrous step. He already in 2021 had sent emissaries, I think including the director of Central Intelligence, who saw Patrushev in Moscow and said, don't do it. I think he did it in together with the US ambassador. And they said, please don't do it. It really makes no sense. It will not work. It will not have a happy outcome. And Patrushev, in this kind of great Russian way, who are you to talk to us? We're a great power and so on. Basically, they treated them as little boys, and they packed them out. They kicked them out. And they returned to the White House and said, Putin is determined to have a war, and he will have a war. And I think Biden actually did take steps to protect the country. There were some U.S. Army trainers present in Ukraine before the invasion. And I think the ability to defend the presidential office and to defend Kyiv and the leadership of the country on the streets of Kyiv was crucially provided by the highly trained specialists who had been trained by the Americans. So I actually think this was very good. The CIA was initially told to withdraw from Kyiv, and it did, but it didn't leave Ukraine. They found a different outpost closer to Poland, and in a matter of weeks, they were back in Kyiv, working with the Ukrainians. So I think in that regard, Biden did everything right. What he didn't do, or rather his National Security Council had refused to do, was to give better weapons to Ukraine to defend themselves.
Yeah. Putin has a very isolated, small circle of people he talks directly to. Who is his main surrounding advisors, and what are their opinions? Because I feel like they're influencing Putin's opinions a lot.
Well, I am not a Kremlin insider, so I don't know. I have to believe that people like Peskov, when they speak, they actually speak on his behalf.
Yeah.
And everything I've seen coming out of Peskov was probably Putin's mind. All the others, well, you know, it's all questionable. So I would have to know much more about the Kremlin to answer your question with any degree of competence.
I know you, on one of the other talks you gave, you spoke about Alexander Dugin and his opinions. That's what, if you know sort of what his main opinions are, anybody along like similar influence and similar level of friendship that Putin sort of has?
Well, Dugin obviously is somebody who postures as a philosopher. He is really a murderer, as far as I'm concerned, or rather an advocate for mass murder, and a fool because he keeps dragging religion into politics. So when somebody like Dugin says, if I'm quoting him accurately, we don't need Ukraine, Jesus Christ needs Ukraine. Well, you can just, give up on everything, because once it's actually Jesus, then it's God, then therefore there is no disputing anything, right? But that brings us back to the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan was a divinity, or Henry VIII in England, where he's head of church and head of state at the same time. It just makes no sense, So I think Putin is probably too smart to fall for this, and I think he is too much of a KGB atheist to believe that Jesus has a particular design for Ukraine. I think he's way too cynical. And I think that Dugin is probably too, but he fakes it at least,
Well, thank you so much for this interview. I really enjoyed and learned a lot.
Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.